Evening, everybody. How are you? It is great to see you all, and I will say that I already know that being the opening for Mike Johnston is, I told him a couple of weeks ago, I'm so glad I'm going first, and that you get to close. But I will also say in the short time that I've been in Illinois the last couple of hours, I will say this, you all are a hearty group. Illinois, folks from Illinois put my former New Englanders to shame, and I will be sure to use examples of you all traipsing out in this weather to be here. It's clearly a packed house, and I think it says a lot about your commitment to education, your commitment to the young people in the state of Illinois, and also your commitment to lead from where you sit. And so I bring you greetings not only from the Education Trust, but from our nation's capital. And it's so nice to be in friendlier political territory. I said, you would never know these people disagree with one another because you're smiling and shaking one another's hands. And I would much rather be amongst you all than go back to DC any day. But in terms of what we're here for this evening, I want to take a little bit of time, not much this evening, to really reground us and to connect you all and your work here in Illinois to a larger conversation, larger work going on nationally in education, and specifically how the work that we are all doing really connects to deeper issues of equity. And oftentimes in the cacophony of voices, we forget that actually what we're grounded in doing is really in moving the needle to the next level on where kids are achieving. And so what I'd like to do is start actually with some successes. And it's so easy when we're in our everyday life and we look at how far we have to go to not recognize that actually the work over the last decade or so has actually yielded some successes. And I think that that's important because often when we talk about getting down and dirty about what needs to happen next, right, and getting our hands dirty and really rolling up our sleeves, sometimes we don't take time to look at where we've come from. And the reality is that actually right now we do have more of our young people graduating high school and going to college. And if you look at our high school graduation rates, and there's been a lot of conversation and communication around this, they're definitely not where we want them to be. There are still gaps, particularly for Black students and Latino students, but you'll see that we have experienced some success. And I know as a former teacher, as a former district administrator, that if you can't even get kids to high school graduation, then you might as well even stop the conversation, right? Because that really is a minimum entry point, and we have begun making some progress on that. And if we look at our college going rates and some of the data that this slide is showing us, what we're seeing is that we actually are doing a better job at creating kind of what I call entry-level opportunities, right? So we actually do have increases in college going rates for all students, right? So this graph is showing us the percentage of high school graduates that are immediately enrolling. And if you look at the differences between 1972 and 2012, it's not nearly where we want it to be, but we actually have seen an uptick. Right? And so part of this is because nationally we have been focused on these markers, right? High school graduation and getting kids to college. But what's been really interesting about this work, and I always revert back to my experience as a former middle school teacher, and I revert back to my current living experience, and Jim, Mike, and I got to bond as parents in the car ride up from Chicago, and also as a parent. And when I look at the landscape and see that we actually have made progress, one of the things that I have to ask myself, though, is while we have opened up opportunity, have we actually increased the actual skills, proficiency, and knowledge that our young people have? So we've done a good job in beginning to move the needle. But the educator in me knows that it's one thing to have a piece of paper. It's another thing for that piece of paper to actually translate, right, into life changes that mean something for kids, that means something for young people. And so in my last 2 months when I was chief academic officer in Baltimore City, and I was addressing my principals for what I later realized would be the last time, one of the things that was interesting, I had a room about this size filled with primarily high school principals, and we were going back and forth about how hard this work is, and they were like, Sonia, look, I mean, just to get kids to graduation, like, my God, why are you on my back about this? I mean, it's just hard enough to get them to graduation. And I said, absolutely, but I want you to hear through the voice of a young person why it has to be more than just that. And so what I'm going to do for you now is actually play for you what I played for them at this conference when they were asking me why we needed to care and why we needed to do more. And what is wonderful about being able to use this video here is because actually this is a young man who is a native from the fine state of Illinois in the city of Chicago. And this is a presentation that Malcolm did at a TED Talk. And it was a TED Talk specifically in education. I have some people nodding, so that's always a good thing. That means you've previewed it for me already. And when I played this, immediately after, I'll give you a little preview, the room was quiet. And I had one of my gnarliest high school principals call out at the end of this and said, we get it, Sonia. We get why we can't stop the work at these entry-level successes. So I want to just play this for you.
At 7:45 a.m., I opened the doors to a building dedicated to building, yet only breaks me down. I march down hallways cleaned up after me every day by regular janitors, but I never had the decency to honor their names. Lockers left open like teenage boys' mouths when teenage girls wear clothes that covers their insecurities but exposes everything else. Masculinity mimicked by men who grew up with no fathers. Camouflage worn by bullies who are dangerously armed but need hugs. Teachers pay less than what it costs them to be here. Oceans of adolescents come here to receive lessons but never learn to swim. Part like the Red Sea when the bell rings. This is a training ground. My high school is Chicago, diverse and segregated on purpose. Social lines are barbed wire. Labels like regulars and honors resonate. I am an honors, but go home with regular students who are soldiers in territory that owns them. This is a training ground to sort out the regulars from the honors, a reoccurring cycle built to recycle the trash of this system. Trained at a young age to capitalize, letters taught now that capitalism raises you, but you have to step on someone else to get there. This is a training ground where one group is taught to lead and the other is made to follow. No wonder so many of my people spit bars, because the truth is hard to swallow. The need for degrees has left so many people frozen. Homework is stressful. But when you go home every day and your home is work, you don't want to pick up any assignments. Reading textbooks is stressful, but reading does not matter when you feel your story is already written, either dead or getting booked. Taking tests is stressful. But bubbling in a Scantron does not stop bullets from bursting. I hear education systems are failing. But I believe they're succeeding at what they're built to do, to train you, to keep you on track, to track down an American dream that has failed so many of us all.
What I would argue is that our job is to actually provide the kinds of experiences that help our young people know that actually it is not just about getting them part of the way there, it's about getting them the full way there. It's not about settling for the initial successes. It really is about digging deeply. And I would argue that the next phase of whether you call it reform, improvement, whatever the localized version of momentum for improved education is, and reducing gaps, is tied to going deeper into what young people are actually learning and what they're experiencing. Now, I'm here to tell you that as an educator, I would be booed off the stage with anybody that I ever taught with or lived next to if I were to tell you that any standards, even the Illinois learning standards in and of themselves, are going to by themselves transform, right, the kind of bifurcation that Malcolm references in his piece. I would also be disingenuous to tell you that an assessment in and of itself is going to rectify the bifurcation that Malcolm referenced. But I will also tell you this, that what we've seen is that without those two very important components, we don't have a real understanding of where our young people are and where it is they need to go. And so when we take that deeper look, what we see is that too many of our young people still aren't prepared for post-secondary education or work. And so one of the things within Ed Trust that we do is we have been following, like many of you and many others, we've been following the NAEP scores, right, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, because one of the things that the NAEP scores tell us is not just what kind of fundamental, right, early learning kind of entry baseline, what I sometimes call basement entry door requirements are. They at least have given us a picture of what true proficiency, true skill, mastery actually looks like, and the kind of skills that are going to give you access, even if, as Malcolm referenced, you're not in the, quote, honors track, but you are just going to school every day. And so what standards allow us to do is to be able to say we know that the floor we're using for everybody's kids is the same floor and door that we're using for our own kids. So I used to tell teachers, if you don't feel good about what you're teaching, or you want to benchmark it against something, you tell me whether you would want your child sitting in your school at any point. And so what the standards allow us to do is to be able to say, allowed me to be able to say, where are we on that trajectory? And so what we see when we look at that is that actually 1 in 4, right, so this slide is saying that literally out of every 4 high school students we see, 1 of them, when they're graduating with the degrees, right, that I celebrated as a chief academic officer, 1 out of 4 of them are still reading at a below basic level, right? What the NAEP is showing is that actually, when we're looking at math and we talk about high-tech jobs, right, and my dad was a chemist, right, back before really there was this focus on STEM. And we know, he knows, right, that math is fundamental to that, and we talk about the explosion in the tech industry. Well, right now, we have only 1 in 10 Black, Native, or Latino students who are ready for that. So as we move through, what we're seeing continually is that the standard we thought we had, the standard that we thought was good enough to get us there, really isn't the standard that we needed. And so the reason why the Illinois learning standards are important, the reason why so many people are saying the standards need to change is not because they're a panacea, but because they give us a benchmark of where we need to be. They give us the benchmark of knowing that in my kid's school, in our zip code, in our neighborhood, the standard the target is exactly what it needs to be across town. So as we move through, and one of the things that we're seeing is this mismatch, and you're seeing it, as you can see here, right, between your Illinois assessment of student proficiency and what we know, at least through NAEP, that we can predict is coming. So when people say, and you all know, as educators in other states know, that often what we were assessing before wasn't really the target. And so now that we're shifting the target, we've all got to get used to the fact that, what we thought was proficient actually wasn't. And it's going to take us some time to get there, but we need to not change the target just because it gets hard. The other piece we know, and this is the math, the other piece we know, and this is just running through, again, some of your Illinois data, and I will just tell you, I could map up, it's not just there's something up with Illinois, just about every state, right, that is making the courageous shift to up their standards is going to experience similar drops. So this is not an Illinois issue, this is a national issue. This is not something kind of wrong with Illinois kids, right, or Illinois teachers. This is something we're all going to have to get used to. But if we interpret it in a way that we're shifting the ground, we're righting the playing field, what we were looking at before wasn't telling us the real story, that helps or should help us to realize that the shift is necessary, but it's going to take some time to get there. Now, when we look at why assessments, and people tell me, right, all the time, Sonia, look, and to be frank, a lot of teachers that I speak to actually don't have real issues with a lot of the new standards, be it Common Core, be it Illinois Learning Standards. It's not the standards, but they're worried about the assessments. Why do we need these assessments? Can't we just kind of let people go and not have these looming assessments? Well, one of the things that we know when we looked at that data is that actually the assessments we had weren't giving us the information we needed, right, about where kids were according to this new standard. And so what happens when you actually look at the assessments is they're asking very different questions than even the assessments I took when I was in 4th grade, 8th grade, or 12th grade. And so just as an example, this is a sample grade 4 reading item. So when people ask me, why do we need to change the tests, right? It doesn't need to be PARCC. Why does it need to be PARCC? This is a real example. So this formally was a grade 4 reading item. And if I'm completely honest, this looked like the kind of question when I entered Baltimore City, the kids were being asked, and when I read the data and they told me 75% of the kids in Baltimore City are proficient readers, this was the kind of question they were answering. That's not a bad question, right? But it's fairly general. What's the theme? You've got 4 choices, bubble it. Let me show you the difference with PARCC. What you'll see in terms of the difference is that now students actually have to relate, right, what's happening in one paragraph and why that's actually important to the overall theme or message of the story. The second piece you'll see is that kids actually have to be able to surface evidence, right, from the text. Now, how many former or present lawyers do we have in the audience? If you are in touch with the legal system in any way, shape, or form, go ahead. I know people are like this. I don't want to admit it, right? You and everybody else who's laughing knows that the ability to be able to read, to be able to go back into what you're reading and then defend it with the evidence from what you're reading is essential to what we would call professional skills. So part of what PARCC is setting us up to do is to say, how do we ask different questions of kids? Not that everything we know about what a young person can do is going to show up on a test. And any educator worth their weight in salt would never say that everything we need to know about kids is in any test. But what we do know is that the kinds of questions we ask This is from grade 7. The kinds of questions we ask change what our expectations are of kids. The kinds of questions we ask signal to kids what we think they are capable of. It does not mean that we expect them all to get there immediately tomorrow, but it does communicate to them what we think of their capabilities. So when I would walk into classrooms and high school students would tell me, oh, they're just asking me to fill in some crossword puzzle. They knew immediately, based on what they were asked to do, what we thought their capability was. But when we asked them to do something harder, when we asked them to actually compare across books, across elements that they've read, which you can see here, right? It's not just, what do you think? Write me a story. And I love the former middle school teacher. We all used to give the assignments. What would you do about school uniforms? Are you for them? Are you against them? Nothing wrong with the prompt. Everybody loves to reflect on school uniforms. But when we get down to the bottom line, I think everybody would admit young people actually having to read 3 different titles and then come together and form an argument is far closer to what everyone in this room, including myself, would expect their own middle school student to do. And that's the bottom line. That if I am honest, if we are all honest, I expect my 3 daughters to be able to answer this kind of question in middle school. And anyone who is only expecting them to answer this would have to answer to me. So the question then becomes, are we willing to hold the ground on what we know is the standard we would have for our own children? And how do we use Park, not as the final end-all to be-all, but how do we use Park to help us get there?
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I think I'd just like to tell a couple of stories about this work in context for me as an educator in Colorado and now as a legislator, and a little bit about the emotional connection between what we're trying to accomplish. And I'm excited for the question and answer, and I have spent the last 5 years in the legislature, and so are in the midst of a lot of these same struggles, both on standards, on assessments, on school funding and school finance. And so look forward to a conversation and a back and forth about this as we sit down to question and answer. I will say when the question of standards comes up, the first story that comes to mind for me is when I first took office as a senator 5 years ago, I represent the eastern half of Denver, which for us is the highest poverty district in the state of Colorado and has traditionally been the most violent district in the state of Colorado. So we have our most significant gang problems in Colorado are all based in my district. And so I don't know about you all, but in Colorado we don't have district offices. We just have an office at the Capitol. And so when I got elected, I decided in taking a book from some of the legislators who'd served before me in my district that what I would do with my resources instead of spending a bunch of time on yard signs because I was in a safe district was to try to open a community office. And so I opened this community office in the heart of one of our toughest gang-ridden neighborhoods that used to be a restaurant, and the guy that had the restaurant in the middle of the night ripped out all the restaurant supplies, put it on his truck, and took off. And so we had this sort of partially stripped down building that was a half restaurant, half former dentist's office. And so moved in with a couple of community nonprofits, and we were just about a week in, and it was, we were preparing to do a big moving in party. And on that Saturday, I was going to bring my kids over to the community office to help clean up, and there's a little front yard place where they like to play. And then last minute, my wife had to go to work, and I couldn't manage getting them all there, so just sort of took them out to the yard in front of our house instead and thought I'd go back later. And later that night, I get a call from the police, and they say, "Hey, Mike, we just want you to know there was a shooting at your community office, and we think everybody's okay, but you should probably come over and take a look at it." And so I come over and I go to sit with the commander to walk through the office. And out front of the office, there are 3 big bullet holes on the side of the office. And there was someone, they didn't care about us, there was someone coming by in a car shooting at the house across the street, and the house across the street shot back. And the 3 bullets come in right in that little playground where my kids like to come and hang out in the morning, where we would have come that morning if I could have gotten my act together to actually come over to the office. And I had never seen this before, but when you walk up to the site of a crime, the police mark each of the bullet holes. And I walk up to the side of my office, and there on the side of my office is a little A, a B, and a C for each bullet hole. And as I'm looking at these, I didn't know. I said, what is this? And one of the community members came by and said, yeah, those are the first ABCs the kids in our neighborhood see, because they're the ones they're used to on the walk to and from school. I thought about in that moment both my fear of the risk I would have put my kids in if I had brought them to play in that space, and the reality of the fact that all the kids that lived next to my community office were walking to and from school every day in the midst of that risk every day, in the midst of that reality of the first A, B's, and C's you see in the morning may not be a book. They may actually be on the side of a building. And for me, it just called into relief the fact that if you look at the history of discrimination in this country, it has been fundamentally about two things. One is equity and access to resources, and the other is equity of expectations. Is the actual belief that that ought not to be every child's only exposure to the ABCs is that walk, but that danger certainly is reflected in the expectations of the kids and the neighbors and the schools. And what we were after in the debate about standards was finally, once and for all, to say, we believe there ought to be equity of expectations. There ought to be a belief that whatever ABCs you see on the way into school, the ABCs we expect you to master within that school remain the same. And I think this drives us to the much more controversial question of testing and what is the role now of testing in this conversation. I look back, if you look at 1926, when the SAT was first invented. There's a fascinating story on this in the Atlantic Monthly maybe 10 years ago. And the origin of the SAT was Ivy League schools on the East Coast had this radical idea that they wanted to diversify their population. They wanted not just the white guys from Andover and Exeter, they also wanted some white guys from Colorado and Illinois, if they could find them. But the problem was that was an incredibly risky proposition, because you knew the admission, you knew the headmaster at Andover, so you could always just call him and say, give me your 20 best guys, send them over to me. And there was no risk there. The notion that you could actually take a high school transcript from Andover and from Allentown or from Akron, Colorado with 40 kids in it and look at that 3.8 and make a real decision seemed impossible to any admissions counselor. 7 days a week, you pick the Andover kid over the Akron kid in that debate. So they said, what if you had actually some common metric that would allow us to identify the few decently smart people out in the other 37 states of the country if we wanted to bring some more white men out here? Hence was born the SAT. I joke about that. But when you look at the context of what the SAT has done in just the last 2 years, the SAT and the College Board has now started the strategy where one of the greatest losses they see is that what we call high-achieving, college-ready, low-income kids dramatically under-matriculate to universities. So kids who grow up on the south side of Chicago or the east side of Denver or the southern part of our state who are low-income but are 30s on the ACT or 1400s on the SAT, those kids are going to college at much lower rates and to much less competitive colleges than an upper-income kid is with the same 1400 score. So what are they doing now? Well, they're doing what anybody else would do, which is they're starting to gather that data in 9th grade as soon as they get a PSAT data, and they're immediately doing what, say, college recruiters have done for the last 50 years. When you heard about a kid that ran a 4.540 in the 9th grade, you send somebody out to take a look at him. So right now, what do? They send every one of those kids 4 immediate fee waivers to apply to any college they want. And now they're starting to get them information up front about their chances and their preparedness for college. They partnered with the state of Delaware on this. In 2 years, they went from somewhere around 20% of their college-ready low-income kids applying to college to 98%. Simply because they had the information to find these kids and say, we think you have a real opportunity, let us get you that information more quickly. And so the question of assessments is a question of how can you use data if you had it effectively? And the other thing is also true, right? I don't know about you, but I love sports. I love to watch the Olympics. I can't help the fact that every year when I watch the Olympics, I have to wait at the end of every night to check on the medal count, right? They do that little thing where he tells you, don't worry, right now America is at 47 and Russia is at 43. And I'm like, yes, okay, like, we're okay for one more night. Imagine how that moment would feel if Brian Williams, if he was still there, was telling us that the US was at 34th in the medal count, right below Ukraine, right? Or Slovenia. There would be riots in the streets of Colorado Springs where the US training ground is, I can tell you. And I don't think the response would be, well, you know what? The Olympics are really hard. Maybe the US should just join the Pan Am Games, because the Pan Am Games aren't that hard. We could probably win that. I think instead you would see a dramatic and courageous and probably angry response to say, damn it, we're the best in the world at this. And until we show everyone else that we're the best in the world at this, we're not going to rest. Right? But I think that what we've seen in the conversation about education is a different one, is that somehow if we're not performing well, we should beat ourselves up about it, or we should just concede that that's always going to be the case, rather than feeling like we got sucker punched and said, all right, I'm going to remember the guy that did that, and I'm going to make sure I train and come back bigger and stronger and better and never lose this contest again, right? And it just goes to what your expectation is. Our expectation has always been we win the medal count, right? I mean, our expectation is that if you don't win the Super Bowl, John Fox, we can't keep you. The guy won 4 AFC West titles and got fired, right? Because our expectation was not, we just want you to compete each year. We just want to be in the mix. Our expectation is if we don't win a Super Bowl, then don't come back. I think the question now is how do we use that data to be totally clear about demanding the same things out of our own kids and raising those expectations to match the place where we would expect of our kids, what we would expect of our best athletes. And so I think the fundamental challenge here is I think there is a belief that not telling someone that they're sick will make them well. And I don't know where that belief comes from. Because the notion that hiding that low performance or that injustice or that inequality is somehow helpful, I think is the most arrogant thing one can do. I think in my mind it probably borders on immoral, if not malpractice, right? Because the belief is, when would you ever say, I think for your own good I probably shouldn't tell you that you're sick? When would you do that? You would do that if you knew they were dying and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Maybe. Maybe if my parent had a terminal illness and they've got 2 weeks left and you don't want her to worry about it for 2 weeks, you just say, you know what, let's just enjoy your last 2 weeks. If that's the judgment we're making about a third grader who's behind grade level, what we're saying is, you know what, baby, we're not going to bother telling you the bad news because frankly, there's nothing you can do to change it. And so you might as well just keep on doing what you're doing and not know that you're about to run into a buzzsaw. And here's the crazy part about it. What you're all envisioning is what I'm envisioning, right? Which is the kids in my district who are predominantly low-income black and brown kids who are making it to college and through at a 9% rate. Let me tell you this piece of data. You think of Colorado as a pretty white state, and it is. And you think of Colorado as probably a pretty well-educated state, and it is. What percentage of all kids in the state of Colorado, which are mostly white suburban kids, are, according to the ACT, ready for a 4-year college? What percentage of upper middle class white folks with parents with 2 or 3 degrees who think their kids are doing great, what percentage of those kids are going to go to University of Colorado at Boulder and not have to call mom and say, sorry mom, I got to take a remedial class in English? Only 25% of the state of Colorado is college ready. There's a whole lot of white folks in that category. A whole lot of middle class folks in that category. But there is a belief that some of the strongest places where we see the opt-out movement are coming from those communities, where they're very satisfied with the existing social strata that puts their community where it is. If you tell some hard truths about actually how prepared those kids are to compete, not just with kids around the state, but kids around the globe, it paints a much tougher picture. I, for one, would want to know that hard truth, and would want to know it as early as possible so I could do something about it. I think that's the question that awaits us on assessments. I'll say one thing about school finance, because I spent about 2 years of my life on this one and made a lot of mistakes I can help you avoid, hopefully. Which is to say, this equity issue of opportunity matters if you create a system that has equity of financing. And if you say we believe a couple things. One is we believe that our system ought to be accountable for the impact of public dollars that we spend. We ought to know where every dollar goes, and we ought to know what outcomes we get for that dollar. Which means, as a teacher, it helps you identify, if I got 3 classrooms, one's doing a fantastic job and 2 aren't, I'd love to know what's working in that one classroom so I can share it with the 2 that aren't. If I have schools or systems or districts that are making fantastic investments with the same dollars and getting breakthrough results, we want to know exactly how they spent those dollars so they can build a map for us to all get better. And then I think in addition to that, you want to say, and we want to build into the formula a system that says we want you, educators and communities, to prioritize most the kids who need you the most. Which means we ought to build a system like the one that we tried to build in Colorado that says the higher the needs of a student, the more the dollar signs that walk in that door with that student. Because I will tell you, as a former principal, you get every time in November or December the kid who walks in the door to register for the first time. You know, he's been hanging out for 3 months. And I can tell you in Colorado, the first sign he's a troublemaker is that kid is always wearing a Raiders jersey. Always. That is the one sort of profiling that I always endorse. And your incentive as a school leader is if you take that kid who's 3 months behind, hasn't done a lick of work, is probably an attendance challenge, you are going to get, if any money at all, if he comes after the October count date. If you all have a single count date like we do, you get nothing if he comes October 3rd or beyond. But even if you do, you're going to get the same amount to support that student who is first-generation immigrant, undocumented, non-native English speaker, 3 grade levels behind, as I'm going to get for the student that comes in 3 grade levels ahead. What rational actor in a system doesn't in their gut, even if they don't want to acknowledge it in their heart, see those 2 kids walking in the door and think, wow, I should tell that kid in the Raiders jersey about this great high school down the road. He would really do well. What you want is the opposite system, which is when Raiders walks in the door, I think, oh, this kid's going to be tough. Maybe, but this kid's going to come with all of the resources my team actually needs to support him. Then you create a system where you got folks trolling the 16th Street Mall, finding kids with Raiders jerseys to put them into school, instead of trying to send them out of school. So I think that is a deep change in human behavior you can drive through something as unsexy as a school finance formula. I'll close with this story. So I have long days in this work, as I'm sure that you do. And when I do, I go back to touchstones for me of the legacies that I hope I inherit, of the work that I hope I'm finishing, of the footsteps that I hope I'm following in. And for me, that guidebook is often the civil rights movement, an example of a movement that set really ambitious goals about what justice looked like and found ways against the odds to succeed at them. And here's the short story I'll tell. The history teachers in the crowd will know this, but I didn't. It's a story that we all know about the bus boycott, except for there is a gap between the perception of the story and the reality of the story, which is the perception of the story is Rosa Parks refuses to sit down. She is this sort of innocent elderly woman who is not complicit in the plan when in fact she was deeply a part of it. Dr. King stands up and gives a speech, and the segregated bus system collapses. Right? That's the 30-second historical narrative. The reality of the story is when the bus boycott was originally planned, the boycott was planned for one day. And after a very successful one day, they all came back to the church and said, wow, that was great. What do we do next? And for the school administrators in the room, like imagining living one day without buses is terrifying enough, not to mention an entire year. And in that conversation, people are arguing back and forth, and there is a woman standing in the back of the church who raises her hand and says, excuse me. And they call on her, and she says, hey, her name is Mary Jo Smiley. And Mary Jo Smiley says, I just want to say that I have a car. And whoever's running the meeting says, thank you, that's very cute. We're trying to solve problems here. That's not what we're talking about. And she says, no, I have a car, and I would be willing to take 10 people every day to and from work. All of a sudden, the room stops. Well, who else has a car? We get groups of 10 opening up around the room. Someone has taxis that they can help with. All of a sudden, there's a plan to say, what if we could actually execute on getting these 10 people? This is 1955. There is no, I'm going to order my groceries online or do my banking online. This is getting you to grandma's house, to the laundromat, to the bank, to your cousins, all of it. And so they build a plan. The next day, Mary Jo Smiley goes, picks up 10 people, gets them to work, gets them home. She does it on day 5 and day 10 and day 30 and day 50. And around day 60, Her boss gets furious that they can't break this insurgency, and so they find out that Mary Jo's a part of it, and they fire her. She loses her job. Day 51, picks up her 10 people, gets them to work, and gets them home. And on day 60 and day 100 and day 150, and around day 150, the fury is so great now that they're not willing to satisfy for getting her fired. So they arrest her. They arrest Mary Jo Smiley and put her in jail for, I don't know what, conspiracy to commit equality, I suppose. They put her in jail, and the leaders of the movement now find out this poor little woman in the back of the room who raised her hand is in jail. And they speed down to the jail, pay her bail, get her out, apologize, we're so sorry, we never meant to happen, please, please go home. And as they're talking, she says, stop. Where are my keys? I got 10 people, I gotta get to work. And the next day, she gets up and gets her 10 people to work and home. And on day 200 and 250 and 300 and 350 and 378, until finally the system says, we give up, we break. And I tell you that not just because it is an example of the way that dramatic change happens, which is not in the one historic speech that we give in the front of the room, but in the deep commitment to execution and implementation along the way, but also in a world that has relentlessly clear metrics about what we want to accomplish and an explicit way to know how we're doing on that every day. It was very clear for Mary Jo Smiley. I got 10 folks. I got to get them from here to work and home, and I got to get them there every day until the work is done. In the same way that the teachers in this classroom have 30 or 130 or 180 kids, they have to get from here to there and home every day until the work is done. I would argue that if we are going to make a push for educational equity and not demand that we know how our kids are doing along the way, it is only a move to get us from slavery to Jim Crow. It is only a move to get us to say, okay, we won't say you can't vote anymore. We'll just make sure you never have the information you need to know how to vote. We'll say you can go to school anywhere you want now, but we'll make sure you never have the information you need to know where your kid actually needs to succeed. That is not a system that is built for success. But if you believe in the old promise that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that promise requires us to build a system that actually views kids that way. I think that's the work that you're in right now, and it's not going to get easier, it's going to get harder. But at the end of that outcome is the possibility to actually deliver something no one else has ever delivered, which is a place where a kindergartner in every one of your districts is going to walk into kindergarten with the same chance that 13 years later she's going to walk out with a cap and gown on her head, a chance to go to college, a chance to support a middle-class family. That is what they meant when they said we hold these truths to be self-evident. Thanks so much for having me.
So you've met Sonia and Mike. I hope you understand now why we thought it was a good idea to bring them in here to have a conversation with us. And Providence must have agreed, because with all the ice out there, the fact that their planes both got here on time, landed, and they were able to make the trip from Chicago to Springfield and be here on time is nothing short of miraculous. Let me also introduce you our third panelist. We're introducing Beth Purvis to join us. Beth is the new, her title is Secretary of Education. She is coming to this work with, God, I don't know, decades of experience across the board. She's not only been the Director of Early Childhood Learning here in Illinois, but she's also served on the faculty of University of Illinois at Chicago. She has a degree in special education. She has worked with children with disabilities for 15 years before her role just before this, which is heading up the Chicago International Charter Schools, a network of charter schools in Chicago and actually beyond. So she's got an enormous amount of experience, which she practices, I'm sure, to their great joy and delight with on her 2 children back at home in Chicago. So Beth, thank you for joining us and rounding us out. So you all have paper and pens in front of you. You all know I'm not shy and I'll ask questions all night long, but you also know I'm very interested in what it is that's on your mind. So please, write down a letter. We've got a number of people circulating, and they'll bring them up to me, and I will weave them into discussion as well. But let me start. You've given us a lot to think about. And I want you to know that we had invited Sonia and Mike many months ago. So the fact that we're in the middle of a very lively conversation about Park is not entirely surprising. But their timing here, obviously, we planned this a while ago. And I explained to them there's a lot of current discussion and activity about that. So let me start with this. So, Sonia, you've told us a little bit about why Park is different. You know, we're in the middle of transitioning. In fact, I think the testing is starting. New students are sitting down in front of Park. I think it's fair to say that there is a non-trivial amount of anxiety that everybody has. Students have, that parents have, that teachers have, that administrators have. And you explained to us what some of the differences are and why it matters and why you think it's helpful. But can you also go, there is discussion, and Mike touched on this a little bit. You know, should we take a pass on that this year? Should we wait till the kinks are worked out in the test? Should we pull and if we didn't as a state choose to do that, should we pull our kids out for a year? Can you share, that is a live conversation, not only here but elsewhere. Can you give us some thoughts, take us the next step in your discussion and give us some thoughts on that?
Sure. So, and I actually get asked this question a lot in terms of opting out, and does it, you know, why would you or would you not? And I think the real answer for me is we need a representative population of kids to know how well we're doing, right? And the opting out doesn't change the fact that we still need to know whether kids are doing well, right? We need to know where they are, and Mike did touch on this, that the temperature check, we cannot be afraid that it's not going to look right. And I think if we go back to, for example, I was in Massachusetts when Massachusetts switched standards, and it was scary for folks. It was scary. People didn't know how kids were going to do. They didn't know whether it was too hard. And I will tell you that if we all know that this first round is a benchmark round, right? It's to set the baseline. It's not a judgment on our schools, our teachers, and our kids for forever. It's setting where we start, right? And so, and I will just say, true confession, my daughter is hopefully in the bed if my husband got in her bed. She's sitting for the Park tomorrow. So in Maryland, at third grade, Park, she's taking the test tomorrow. And I think part of the responsibility we have as leaders, and I say that as a former school leader, as a teacher leader, district leader, national leader, is we have the responsibility to let people know that this is a benchmark year, that we're setting the baseline, that there are no final judgments. In my daughter's school, she did not come home throwing up. She did not come home in tears. And some of that is because her teachers, her principal, her parents told her, it's a test. Let's see how we do. Let's get the information, and then we know where to go from here. And I think if we let people know that we're not here to condemn, right? We're not here to give a life sentence to children. We're here to take a temperature check as a community, as a nation, to know then how we move forward. So opting out, and I get this question a lot, it doesn't help us get the real sense we need. And that's why we need everybody there. We need everybody participating so that we get a real sense of the direction we need to go in.
So, Beth, you're 11 days in this new position. So I think it's fair of me to ask you a complicated and substantive question. That is more than enough time. You've got a big brain.
I'm ready.
So we're here talking about closing gaps. Illinois, and I know everybody in the room knows this, but let me remind you that we have the distinction of having some of the worst achievement gaps by race, some of the worst achievement gaps by income of any state in the country. And while we have made some gains of late generally in our achievement and our graduation rates, which is important and huge and significant, with very few exceptions, we have not started to really see closing those gaps. As you come into this new position and this new way of tackling the world of education, which I know you care about, how important is closing gaps as opposed to just sort of generally working on making things better? Why is that an important, or in your mind, not an important focus?
Well, I think it's very important, but I think we're asking the wrong question when we talk about achievement gaps. And I think both Sonia and Mike touched on this. We need to close the college readiness gap, and we need to close the workforce readiness gap. And again, if we're creating schools for our kids, not for other people's kids, which I think both of the panelists said much more eloquent than myself, we need to think about the goal of education is to prepare students for career and citizenship. And we need to focus on having kids to have the skills and content knowledge they need to be prepared for college, to be prepared for the workforce. And we need to focus, again, on our students who are coming to school not ready in kindergarten or not ready in high school. And we need to ensure that we are focused on supporting our teachers and supporting our principals and our administrators in having the resources they need to be successful with these kids. And one of those things is having the data to be able to make informed decisions. And using that data also to make informed decisions on what we're spending. So I think we also need to look at, in closing these achievement gaps, in where are our students starting, what are the data that we can have so that we can ensure that instruction is focused on their needs, but also to make sure that teachers have the professional development that they need, that administrators have the ability to spend their precious dollars on what each individual child needs or on what groups of children need.
I love that you mentioned resources, because that allows me, Mike, to ask you a two-part question. The first is, how much does, I mean, there's a raging debate, right? I mean, some people are like, look, it's about just doing better with what we've got, and other folks who are like, no, money is really the answer, we're starving. How important, forget, you know, the adequacy, equity conversation, just generally, how important is money to the problems that we're talking about, to closing the achievement gap? How significant an issue is that on its own, as opposed to doing some of these other things, tightening up standards, making sure that we've got more equitable expectations and strategies?
So you know, in the question of, you know, is it about more money, or is it about how you spend it? I think the answer is yes. You know, and so I think for us, we did two things. One is we felt like we had to do a lot of the work around improving the efficacy of where we invested dollars before we looked to expand the number of dollars that came in. So we felt like we had a real public trust building to do with our taxpayers in our state to say, hey, listen, we're going to first show you that we're spending every single tax dollar we have right now the most effectively we can, that you know that we're accountable for them, you know where they're spent, how they're spent, you know we have standards, we have accountability, we have assessments, that will build a framework that will allow you to be informed, and that we'll also do a really deliberate job of identifying places that are doing really great work with that money and working to replicate those investments. And so I have weird feedback, is that just me?
It's okay.
And so, maybe it's my phone. It's better, worse, better, okay. And so I think we try to look at both what we can do to tighten the efficacy of the system as it currently exists, what we can do to make sure we know where dollars go and how effective they are, and then looking at where are the places where dollars are really making a big impact. What we find is there are some places that have the same amount of dollars that are getting vastly different results. And we also find there are a lot of different ways to generate resources. One of the things that we tackled that I know you all are looking at here is when you look at what the formula is for how much local districts contribute their part to the state formula. In Colorado, it's wildly disparate. So if you lived in the district where I was principal, on a $200,000 house, you would pay 30% property tax. You pay 30% mill levy, a 30 mill levy rate. If you owned a $200,000 house in Aspen, if that existed, if you owned a $200,000 bathroom in Aspen, you would pay 2% property tax on that same piece of property. And so what we found is our lowest income districts are taxing themselves at the highest possible rates and still getting the least amount of state support to match that investment. And it's just a game they can never catch up with. I sat in an event at a home in Aspen with one of our rural superintendents who said, the value of this house is more than the entire property base of my district. And so I can add 500 mills onto the property base in my district and not get to what's possible in other districts. And so I think that through no evil intent, we've backed into a scenario where there are lots of ways to make that formula more equitable without having to raise taxes. But my belief is that you needed to do both. We needed to both make the funding more equitable and try to secure more resources.
I'm going to come back to that, but we have an interesting question. Sonia, I'm going to bring to you. If this is truly a benchmark year, is it a good idea, bad idea? What are your thoughts? One of our questioners asking, should the results be kept quieter? I mean, should they be kept at the district level, not shared publicly, really be used in a more internal fashion? Thoughts on that?
Another question. It's nice to know that Illinois follows the country in some of your questions, so I thank you for that. I do think that we have a responsibility to parents, for parents to know where their young people are. I don't think it actually helps the cause of districts to not have that information public. I think it actually helps. And as a former district person, I will tell you this, I would not want to be the only one with that data, because I want everyone to own where we are. It is not just my responsibility, it's the community's responsibility. And so having that public lets everybody see where we really are. Now, yes, does the district own responsibility for charting the plan in terms of the role of schools and everything else? But I will tell you, when I was in Baltimore City, we were very clear with the mayor's people. We were very clear with our State Department of Ed. You are not leaving us floating in the sauce, right? We are all in this together. And in order to do that, I think it is best for that information to be public. And we owe it to the communities that we serve. We are not hiding anything. This is where we are. Let's all get in and roll up our sleeves together.
Let me follow that up. This is not part of it. I am now ad-libbing shamelessly. But let me follow up, because I suspect one of the thrusts is that it's scary.
It is.
I mean, I think the only thing that all of us can be sure about is two things. One, scores are going to go down, probably closer to where we've been on NAEP. And two, it's going to be bumpy. You can't make a transition this big to a whole brand new instrument without that happening. And if we could lower anxiety by keeping it quiet, would your thinking still hold? Have you balanced that in the, just getting, sort of letting people dip their toes into the water?
I just don't think that hiding student achievement results in the end gets you the distance you think it's going to get you. And I do think that there's a way of sharing at a local level. And again, look, you all know your context, but I will just tell you, I think it is more in how we communicate and what we do with the data than in keeping the data quiet. In most cases, when it blows up at a school level or at a district level, it's because people were not prepared along the way. And frankly, at the ground level, we weren't doing what we needed to do to support people and take cover. In Massachusetts, when the scores came out, it wasn't hidden. But we had leaders in every sector who did not leave teachers alone to message. We had, from the governor's office to local representatives to members of the business community, everyone was out communicating. And I think it's more in communication and preparation than it is about keeping things quiet.
Which actually went, when we raised the ISAT, folks will recall that actually, I think went a lot better than folks expected. Let me talk about another question, which I think is very top of mind. Shifting to new standards, as well as new assessments, and I don't know who quite wants to take the first crack at this, requires a lot of time. And I think everybody would agree, whenever there are conversations, and I am sure that you are hearing this every part of the country, how are we do not do a great job about finding teachers and school personnel the time that they need to really thoughtfully plan for that. And so I would ask this in two ways. Mike and Sonia, what are you seeing that other districts or states have done that we can or should consider? Beth, this has to be on your mind. Are there some break the mold ideas that we ought to be looking at, or that we would be prepared to look at in Illinois to try and really free up radically more time than we currently have? It's a simple question, so I know. Just
So
jump right
I
in.
agree totally. So this is, I mean, when I visit classrooms and talk to teachers, this is always the first thing I hear is we want to do this, we want to do it well, but it requires more time. And if you look at, there's a lot of debate about international comparisons of American performance to other countries and about the systems in those countries. One seldom noted comparison to places like Finland is if you look at, I remember as principal, we have a 1,080 hour school year. And in America, for most teachers, in a 1,000-hour school year, you are feet on the floor teaching around 800 of those hours. In Finland, in comparison countries, it's around 400 or 500 hours. So it literally is almost 50% of the schedule is planning time versus instructional time. And so we're working on two things. One is, can you extend the amount of contact time for kids? Because we also know kids need more support to close the
Because
gaps.
kids are not home during that remaining time, to be clear. in
Oh, that's right.
Finland.
That's right. No, kids are in.
don't want
This
anybody
is
under that
not.
impression.
These are similarly long school days. It's just it means different staffing structures to allow adults more planning time while students still have contact time. So we're working on two things. One is extending the amount of school time for students, longer school days and school years. And the second is pairing that with extended amounts of planning time for teachers. And we are in a budget crisis too, and we actually are the only state in the country that has a constitutional amendment that prevents the legislature from increasing revenues. So we couldn't provide more revenues if we wanted to. We have to go to the voters every time we want to do that, and that's never in Colorado history passed. And so we, by definition, have to figure out how to do more with the same. And so what we're looking at is there are some innovative strategies for how you think about a rush hour shift at a lunch restaurant, right? You have someone who does a 8 to 12 shift and someone who does a 10 to 2 shift. You overlap on the 10 to 12 spot, so there's more people on the floor. We're looking at creative staffing structures to try to extend the number of hours that students see instruction while also extend the amount of planning time teachers can have, and we think there are some exciting models to do it.
Beth, anything you want to add?
So I'm sure there are people in this room who have better ideas than I do about this, and I think that's part of the thing that we need to do, is we need to look at the data when it comes out, look at those schools that are performing the highest, and ask those teachers and administrators what they did to create the time for their teachers to understand how to implement the standards with fidelity and see the growth within their own schools. And I think although we talk about a lot about the schools that are struggling in this state, there are also many schools that are performing very well. And I think when the tests come out, there will be some schools, I have great hope and great faith, that will perform very well. And I think we need to look at the field and look where where we are seeing good outcomes. And I think we can also look at currently, I think of the teacher incentive grants that were out that looked at different staffing pattern and teachers doing coaching of other teachers within their classroom. And I think if we look at some of those models that we know work for all improving of practice and apply that here, I think we'll see great improvement both in student learning but in teachers in their own craft.
So let me, an interesting related, and Micah picks up on a point you just made, but any of you to answer this. What role can a community and social services organization, and that, part of all communities, what role can they play in supporting Park? What role can they play in helping children? Is there a role for sort of broadening, who's responsible for that, for the day as we structure it for kids?
Can I jump in for 1 second
Sure.
before that? I think part of it is and I look at the list of different groups and representatives we have here, is we need to have honest conversations. We need to have honest conversations about where we're failing, where kids are failing, and what we can do to improve the situation and to improve outcomes for kids. And I think the best thing about what has occurred in the last few weeks around Park is that there have been some really honest and hard conversations about the pros and the cons. And if we are not willing to have those really hard conversations, we are not going to change anything.
So I'd add to this, I'm very excited about this issue because we're working on this right now. And again, people think data is like so boring and oppressive. This is the excitement for me as a school principal or community leader. So what we're looking at is, suppose you are a middle school teacher who has 5 kids in the 7th grade who are really struggling with reading, right? And you also have 3 kids who are depressed and 2 kids who have family tumult going on at home, and you are overwhelmed by all that, and how can you get support? We have at the same time in our communities all these amazing nonprofits and community networks that are doing after-school support, reading, tutoring, mentoring. Do we have, as a principal, any information that tells us Which one of these 15 after-school tutoring programs are actually most helpful in getting a kid to learn how to read, or most helpful in getting a first-generation Spanish-speaking immigrant who hasn't yet mastered English to learn how to read? The opportunity for us to say, we now not just have data on how the schools do, our nonprofits are fighting to get access to the school data and to share their own data, so we can be in a pool where now as a teacher I could say, okay, this 7th grader that has needs, I know here are the 4 programs in our neighborhood, and here's the one that based on evidence is probably best for her, and I can connect her right away to that service in a seamless way that says, hey, we all have a role to play here. No one's saying that Superwoman or Superman teacher is gonna fix all of this, but the ability to better align the information we have and better provide services together means you get folks rowing in the right direction and not in the wrong direction. We have 2 high schools in my district. One of them has 19 independent mentoring programs going after school right now. One has 0. When the next nonprofit comes to the next funder and says they want to add the 20th mentoring program at that high school, someone should say no. Or someone should say, have you thought of the high school down the road? And someone should say, of the 19 we have, which ones are doing a great job and how do we partner with them more? And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity here for expanding the network of who does this work and us doing it together. I just think that more information is going to be better if we're going to do it well.
One of the things I heard as a theme in your, both Sonia and Mike, your remarks is the importance of digging deep and staying with things. That where you see real change is not just superficial things and then on to the next, but this is the work, this is what needs to be done, and we're just going to keep at it until it's done through thick, through thin. That's not so easy to do. And to stay with things when you've got changes in administration, when you've got changes in sort of the political landscape, when you've got changes in financial fortunes, at really, literally at every level of the work, school, district, on up to the state, politically as well as administratively. How do you carry through that? What are the strategies? What's the advice? I actually think Illinois has been remarkable in its ability to make some decisions and really just plug away, right? Non-sexy, just plug away and keep doing it. And Audrey and I were talking earlier, like particularly good about continuing to talk even when issues get hard and complex. But, you know, we got a long way still to go. I mean, for your analogy, Mike, I don't know which day of driving we're on, but we're in those early days. And what's the trick? What's the secret? What have you seen? What's your advice?
I feel distinctly unqualified to answer this question because we have not figured this out yet. We haven't figured out the outcome. We have figured out the process. And I think the process is we want our decisions to be informed by evidence. And so what we want to do, you know, as a principal, you know, so I ran the bill to change our statewide principal and teacher evaluation system to link 50% of principal and teacher evaluations to student growth. There are some folks who think that's way too much, some who think it's way too little, some who think it's the end of the world as we know it, some who think it's the salvation of the world as we know it, and they're all probably wrong. And so there's been pushes to say, why don't, you know, before we start, let's cut it to 20%, or let's grow it to 70%, or let's make it to 10%. And I think that what we're trying to do is saying, let's implement this and gather information really carefully and honestly from the field about what's working and what's not working. And then let's make reasoned adjustments based on the information. But to be able to say, let's stop doing this before we gather reliable information, to me, I think is irresponsible. But I think the other thing that's irresponsible is to ideologically defend one position because it's the position that I took 5 years ago, right? So as a principal, you never sit down with your faculty and design a new student intervention plan and then implement it and lock yourself in the office for the next year and say, I sure hope it worked.
Though it's tempting.
Yeah, it is tempting. What you do is you implement it, and then you sit down at the next faculty meeting and say, what'd you think? What were the unintended consequences we didn't see? What are the things we can fix and improve? But I think we're in that stage now where we need to do this full, faithful implementation to see what works and what doesn't. I think if you don't, you risk really damaging the data. You know, so I had a law school professor who used to say, the purpose of a prosecutor and a defense attorney is it's like you and your best friend trying to get home and you both disagree on the path. Like, if I agree to walk course A and you agree to walk course B and we both walk them fairly, we'll see who gets home first. If halfway there I decide that my path is lame and just cut over and meet you, we'll never actually know what the data suggested about which of these two routes are more effective. And so I think we need a clear and kind of an uninterrupted set of data from which to make decisions before we start making mid-course corrections.
I would also add that I do think that I think communication matters. And I think that in places where the course is being maintained, people at all levels, regardless of who the stakeholders are, feel as if that there's a level of transparency, there's a level of honesty, and there's an openness to actually hear the mid-course corrections. When folks begin to think that the ground is shaking at every point, quite frankly, I can't blame them for considering whether we're really dedicated to it or not, and I think being real clear about who the champions are. And I know that sounds corny or whatever, but I do think people watch. They watch to see who's gonna buckle. And even if leaving office is one thing, but changing your mind too quickly, as Mike was saying, I mean, of course we have to adjust, sends a signal in its own right. And when a lot of the rancor was beginning in Maryland around, is this where we want to go? Is this what we want to do? I had 4 teachers come up to me in the supermarket, and they said, Dr. S., if you tell us you're going to stay the course and you think this is right, then we're on board. But we're watching you. We're actually not watching all the time everyone else. And I think people have the folks that they watch, and I think that's why it's important at every level of investment. So from the teacher-leader level, there are teachers who could care less what I think, but they watch to see the people they respect, and do they believe that this is really the right direction. So I think we can underestimate the power of having champions at every segment of this work and this race.
Let me ask one last question, and then I'm going to wrap us, because several questions have come in, and it's sort of the nature of the conversation we're having tonight that it didn't get addressed as directly, and so I think folks are interested in early childhood. And in the scheme of things, as you're figuring out where to make investments, where does that fit in the priorities when you've got limited resources? What role did it play when you were having those conversations in Colorado, particularly around funding? But just talk a little bit about how that factors into the big picture.
Tremendously important, and we're not funding it well. So this is we don't offer even full-day kindergarten in Colorado. We only offer half-day kindergarten. So literally, if you are a student who can pay for a half-day tuition, then at noon the bus comes and picks up the kids who can't pay and takes them home, and the kids who can stay a full day. It's pretty horrendous. So we're trying to roll it down to 3 and 4 year olds as well, and yet we don't have money we're $1 billion in the hole from our K-12 funding, and we can't recover that because of the restriction on increased revenue. So what we're trying to do is find creative approaches to figure out how to fund early childhood education. The one that I'm working on this year is a proposal around social impact bonds or pay for success financing, which is a system that that Chicago has tried. Many may be familiar with it, but it's a structure by which we allow philanthropic or nonprofit investors to pay upfront investment in early childhood education. And you probably all know the Frederick Douglass aphorism, it is cheaper to build healthy children than to repair broken men. But as you know, we don't finance public services that way. So what this does is allows us to put upfront investment in early childhood. When 3 or 4 years later, we see that investment has manifested itself in decreased expenditures on things like special ed referrals, literacy interventions, READ Act support, which is for students who are behind grade level. The money that is saved from that avoided cost we use to pay back the upfront investors, so it's only paid when the state has met its outcomes. And so this is one creative way we're trying to look for to fund early childhood, because we think it's so important, and yet we don't have the dollars to expand funding to K-12, to early childhood, when we can't yet fund K-12. So that's our intermediate plan.
I would only add that the gains are seen when it is both expansion and attention to quality. Just expanding will not get the bump. There has to be a commitment to quality and not just increasing numbers.
There's a whole other conversation about the work in Maryland on kindergarten readiness, so we'll get to that in another year. Yeah, Beth.
And I wanted to add, I think this is a place where Illinois is leading. And when we look right now, we actually have an objective rating of early childhood programs in the Accelerate program. And so I think that's a place where we can talk about quality of early childhood programs, talk about early childhood options, And it could be a place where both K-12 and higher ed could look towards a quality rating system.
Please join me in thanking Mike and Beth and Sonia for spending their evening with us. I think I offered to eat my hat or some other, item of clothing if you did not find them riveting and interesting, so you'll come up to me later, but I think I'm safe. But, and I don't think I ever introduced myself. For those who don't know me, I'm Robin Staines. I'm Executive Director at Advance Illinois, and I really want to thank a few folks. First of all the folks who have co-hosted this. It's too long a list for me to reread. You want to get home and skate your way on the ice. But really appreciate and love that this is something that we've now done for 4 years. But I think I want to save my biggest thanks for, I'm really struck. I was going to use a different story, and I'm not going to tell it. I'm just going to shamelessly steal, Mike, yours. We are in the early days of driving, but I think there are a lot of thanks to legislative leaders and legislators who have picked up car keys and who have got us in cars. You've made some really tough decisions. You've been willing to wrestle with some hard issues, which are not easy to do in the political domain. And the fact that you've got us in cars and we've got those keys, I think, is enormous, and it's huge, and you deserve a huge round of thanks for that. I mean that. But there are a lot of drivers in this room, and I think maybe even more importantly, there are a lot of drivers around the state who are teaching kids in classrooms every day, who are principals, who are superintendents, who are school board members. And we've got a number of those drivers in the room. Would all the school administrators and teachers stand? Please, I know you're shy. I mean, the rest of us can talk about it, but there isn't anybody who has spent a day in a classroom who doesn't know you've got both the most wonderful and interesting job with the best stories to tell at any of us, but also the hardest and one of the most intellectually and emotionally demanding. But there are other drivers in this room, and I want to also ask those folks who work at the State Board of Education and in the higher ed education, the community colleges, the Board of Higher Ed, and ISAC to also stand, because you guys have an unbelievably thankless job to do, because it's your job to make this work stick. You do it with too few staff, you do it with too few resources, you keep your sense of humor for the most part. I don't know how that happens. Anybody who's ever spent a minute with Chris, raise your hand if, I mean this seriously, raise your hand if you've ever spent a minute with Chris and he has not smiled. It's inconceivable. Honestly, the man should be frowning almost all the time and he never does. So, that's the kind of commitment. I mean, and it's interesting because for those of you who joined us last year, Massachusetts has been a remarkable success story. And what you heard Paul Revel, who was one of the architects of that, say is it mattered that you stick with it. You've got to get the foundations right. You've got to put the money behind it. And then you've got to stay the course. So I hope you're all inspired to do that you are fortified with the right amount of food and drink to do that. The bar, I think, is still open. Thank you so much for joining us on a very unfriendly and hostile weather evening. Have a very good evening.